Welcome to another episode of the Nebraska Gentleman. Today we have a special guest. She has 17 years of experience in developing and producing content for primetime television and streaming platforms in America and overseas. You may have heard of the shows Scandal and How to Get Away with Murder. She's also a great family friend, and I had the privilege of attending her wedding while staying in California in 2016. Her name is the great Nne Ebong. How are you, Nne?
Hi, I'm doing well. It's nice to see you.
You too, you too. And thanks again for joining us after your vacation. Glad you made it back safely too.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
so we're just gonna dive right into it. If you're a creative executive, can you explain more in depth what it is you do and why you chose this field specifically?
Sure. I am a studio creative executive. I primarily focus on developing content. So that job entails seeking out new ideas for television, whether that is intellectual properties that can be adapted into a television series, hearing pitches from writers, producers, directors, but basically finding that kernel of an idea, working with tremendously talented people to develop that into a television series format, and then trying to find the right platform for that to live, which is involves kind of putting your salesman hat on, looking at the marketplace and targeting buyers who might get excited about the show that you want to sell. And then once you've done that, producing the show, hopefully in perpetuity. And why? I think for me, I mean, I think if there are any children of Nigerian immigrant parents listening to this, they will probably all relate when I say it was a pretty unusual career path for someone with my background. But I have always been a storyteller my whole life. I actually went out to Hollywood with the intention of being a screenwriter and did that for the first couple of years of my career. I am a little bit too much of a control freak for that career. So I decided to take the job of the people I was reporting to. But no, I love the creative process. I love the collaborative process. I think for someone like me who was a really shy kid growing up, it gave me this outlet, this opportunity to express my voice in a way that I just didn't have the confidence to do as a young person. I remember my parents always saying, you love TV too much. You can't live inside TV. What's TV going to do for you? So it's quite ironic that I ended up in this career as a television storyteller.
And we're glad you did because just your resume speaks for itself. The amount of shows that you've been able to have a hand in. I imagine you've heard the word no quite a few times, you and your team. I'm very curious to learn, and if you don't mind sharing, what were some of those shows that originally you got the no, but then you went to another platform or pitched it somewhere else and they said yes? Do you mind sharing any of those?
Well, I have sort of a two-part answer for that. I don't have any, I mean, yes, I guess that happens all the time. I have it, to be honest, I have a show right now, knock on wood, that we will be able to shoot this at some point after coronavirus. But we took around a show just last year called The White House Plumbers, um, starring Woody Harrelson and Justin Theroux. And it is about the men who actually perpetrated the Watergate break-in. And it was very surprising to me that that story had not really been told with as many stories as there are, about Watergate. There's sort of the journalist perspective and the White House perspective, but not the perspective of the people who were on the ground doing it, how they did it, and why. And it turns out that it's sort of a tragic comedy. So it felt ripe for a television adaptation. And we took that around. And yes, you're right. You hear a lot of no's. All you really need is that one yes. And for us, that yes came from the place that we wanted to sell it to in the first place, and that was HBO. So, we have sold the show to HBO. We're developing it right now. The scripts are in. We're hoping to be able to shoot that we were planning on shooting that this spring. We're hoping we can shoot that next spring. So hopefully that will be something that, we'll have a lot of places saying, oh, if only I had gotten in on that when I could, because I think we have such a fantastic assemblage of talent. I can speak to one example. I had nothing to do with this one, but one famous example in television is the show Desperate Housewives, which went on to be this cultural phenomenon launched a lot of careers and changed the entire fortunes of a network. ABC was really, sort of in the basement ratings wise at that time. And Desperate Housewives, along with Lost and Grey's Anatomy, both of which launched that year, changed the fortunes of that network. And Desperate Housewives was a spec script. A spec script is something that a writer writes, without any kind of commission. It hasn't sold anywhere. The writer just writes it and then hopes after the fact that someone might be interested in it. And Mark Cherry was that writer. Mark Cherry had been a sitcom writer. One of his big credits was, Golden Girls. He was a young writer on that show at the time, but he was at a point in his career where he just couldn't get arrested, couldn't get hired. His whole background was half hour, and he wanted to write this 1 hour show that was inspired by his mother's experience as, a housewife, and nobody wanted it. Someone at ABC, Steve McPherson, who I think was the head of the studio at the time, or maybe head of the network, he switched between both places, but he found that script, fell in love with it, said, I'm going to take a chance on this person and on this show because I really believe in it. And it ended up being a huge ratings winner, Emmys winner. A lot of networks tried to launch their own versions of that show, and lots of people had the opportunity and just missed it at the time.
Yeah, I'll be honest too. I remember watching, I think it was on Sundays when I
Mm,
was in high school and middle school, watching that with my mom, looking forward to it. I don't
yeah,
remember how it ended, but I do remember some parts.
yeah.
And now I'm curious too, how do you know what platform to pitch a show? How
It
does that
gets
decision get
harder,
made?
believe it or not. It gets harder and harder these days where you have so many platforms to choose from, because I think while logic might say, well, this is so great, you have so many places you can sell to, that's even better than before. What's difficult is every place wants to sort of have its own identity in terms of the type of content that they make. And very rarely is there a show that can be all things to all places. And for me, just as it makes good business sense to find a show that is great and has a really strong point of view, but it's tricky if I find this show and I'm like, this show could only ever live at one place, because then I've spent a lot of money and a lot of time invested in trying to tailor something for a place that for whatever reason may not want it. Maybe they have something sort of similar. Maybe they're out of money that year. So you try to find content that could potentially translate to many different buyers. But at the same time, you try to really stay on top of what shows do they have right now? What are the gaps in their programming? What kind of content are they looking for? So it's a game of constant communication. I have a really great team of people I work with, one of whom, her job as our coordinator is to really be plugged in and be in constant communication with these places to find out, like, how's your development going? Anything that you thought was going to come out really well that's not looking so great? Any gaps we can fill? So it's it's an information game.
With the two pandemics in AI, I'm curious to learn how your work has been impacted, if at all, with systemic racism and then obviously the coronavirus. How has it affected your work in the field as well as being a mother? Has it changed your outlook at all on raising a child or how you work moving forward?
On the parenthood front, I think my husband and I, as just two Black people in America, we were always very conscious of the world in which we live. It's funny, I think prior to the pandemic, our daughter is only 10 months old. So, she's too young to really understand what's going on in the world right now. But we have conversations all the time about, how will we educate her without demoralizing her, about just sort of the very realistic struggles that she may encounter one day because of the color of her skin. We think about things, like we want her to go to a really great school in Los Angeles, but we want that school to be as inclusive of, of different cultures as possible, which is kind of a tall order to get both things in one place. I think the current, what I hope, I'm going to say movement and not moment, because I'm trying to be really, really positive and optimistic about what's happening. But I think the current movement gives us a lot of hope that what I think is different right now, I think that racism is something, unfortunately, that we will always contend with. But what I think is different and is happening right now is that I think a lot of people who just sort of stood by silently or just kind of sat with ease with the idea of like, well, I'm not racist, are starting to re-examine things and take a look at their lives and figure out, how have I contributed to a system? How has my ignorance about systemic racism contributed to the suffering of other people? How can I be better? How can I do better? So I'm hoping she's going to be stepping into or growing up in a world that's slightly more enlightened than before. But I can also say, I mean, these things don't happen overnight. Um, I feel like I would not be a responsible parent if I didn't find ways to just make her aware of the fact that, you know, she has value as a human being, regardless of what, you know, society, media, anything, you know, tells her. So, you know, I think in terms of how has that changed our outlook on parenting, I think it's made us think more globally about just sort of um, the immediate work we need to be doing right now as she's growing up, uh, versus, you know, the practical things like what school is she going to go to, and, you know, that sort of thing. And then work wise, yeah, I mean, Hollywood is, for all intents and purposes, sort of on pause right now. I mean, there are some places that I think have been really innovative and ingenious in terms of trying to come up with programming in a time of COVID. You know, Tyler Perry just finished a full 22 episode season of a show, you know, at his studios. But I think in terms of the long run, you know, like I said, I have a show that was supposed to have started shooting this spring that we probably won't be able to shoot for a year. I have a few other things in the hopper that are just sort of, you know, on pause until we can figure out what production looks like, how to safely come back to work without endangering the lives of the many, many people it takes to make a TV show. And then, so that's, you know, just in terms of logistics. And then creatively, I do find that a lot of places, a lot of these buyers, a lot of these networks, I had a show, you know, in the UK that very abruptly went from being, we love this show, we're so excited to make this show, to, we don't think we can make this show because we've looked at our programming and we have discovered that our programming is, to quote them, relentlessly white. So, which, I mean, it's a promising thing to hear in terms of just a desire to make immediate change. Of course, for that writer who had worked so tirelessly for 2 years to get her show on the air, that was pretty devastating. But I think that a lot of the networks are just looking to see, you know, are we doing our part in terms of furthering this conversation? Companies are having these same conversations about, you know, who their executives are, how their teams are built up, and asking, you know, do we have the right reflection of leadership for the audiences that we're trying to serve?
Yeah, Nate, hmm, I kind of want to touch on two things, especially with what you just said. Do you have hope with those talks moving forward when the pandemic hopefully one day is over? And then my original question being, you know, being in a predominantly white male run industry, I imagine there are times you are reminded that you are a Black female. Do you mind sharing any of those times of adversity that you've experienced and how you dealt with them?
Sure. Yes, I have been reminded that I am a Black female in awkward ways and in really offensive ways. I can't tell you the number of times. I mean, unfortunately, the reality is I've worked far too often in places where I am the only person of color in the room. Um, Definitely, sort of the only Black executive in the room, and sometimes there will be, you know, large um, corporate conversations about, you know, how do we handle, well, let me give one example. I got a phone call one day at my office from someone at the network, at ABC Network. They were going to launch Kenya Barris's new comedy, Blackish, and there was internal concern that the title was really offensive. And so this person had been tasked with tracking down every Black executive in the company I think it was like, 4 phone calls, but just to ask, like, do you find the title Blackish offensive? And that's a really typical thing where you suddenly find yourself the ambassador of Black culture, which I think can be kind of uncomfortable because, we are not a monolith. There are lots of, something I might not find offensive, someone else might find offensive, but there's just not enough representation for people to necessarily, know the direction or even feel like they, as the lone person of color in that room, can speak up in a comfortable way. That's just a sort of a typical thing. That's sort of the awkward example, and that happens a lot. Like, Nne, what will Black people think about this? I've had that many times. The time that comes to mind when I think about being reminded in a way that's offensive, and I'm sure there are like lots of little microaggressions that have happened that I'm not even thinking about now, or that I don't even necessarily clock anymore. But I was working at ABC Studios at the time. This was maybe in 2008, and there had been a writer's strike. Things were very tough financially. The company was talking a lot about, this is 2010, I guess, potential layoffs. And Disney did that year lay off, hundreds of executives. And, people do what they do when you're sort of in times of uncertainty. We would huddle in each other's offices and, sort of gossip or speculate, like, who's next, what's going to happen, will our department be safe? And I was in an office with 2 white male colleagues, and we were all bemoaning, like, oh, like I was saying, well, I was the last one in. So, the last one in, first one out is a pretty familiar adage. And one of the guys said, well, don't worry, you'll be safe. And I said, oh, thank you. Because, I considered myself to be a really strong contributor to the team, and said, yeah, I work really hard. I hope that they recognize that. And he said, no, I mean, you'll be safe because, you're Black. And I said, what does that mean? And he said, well, you're the only Black person on the whole team. So how would that look? So you're lucky, you're automatically safe. And I was so deeply offended by that, because my assumption had been that my value to the team was who I was as an executive, the strength of the work that I was doing. And it felt like in that moment, it had just been reduced down to, you serve a purpose for optics, and that's your value here. And, and I also sensed, within that conversation with those 2 execs, a little bit of a tinge of resentment, because both of them had been there for a really long time. Both were genuinely concerned about their futures at that company, and felt like I, as the new person, had this sort of unfair advantage. So that was very frustrating, very hurtful. And I remember in that moment vowing that I may be the new kid on the block on the team, but I was going to prove that I deserved to be there, and that any, favorable treatment I got was based on merit and nothing else. And, I went on later to become the head of that department and, the boss of one of those guys. So hooray for me. But I feel like always in the back of my head, there was the feeling that I had something to prove, which is not something I think a lot of my white colleagues, walk around with every day, that your best is not good enough. It has to be above and beyond.
And first of all, congrats on that promotion. But does that thought for you ever go away? Because, I mean, I'll be honest, at times that thought creeps into my mind of if I'm only getting something because of the color of my skin. And you actually had it said to you as one of those rude examples, which I'm sure there's even worse things said that we're not bringing to mind. But does that thought still stick with you today? Or do you just trust your work and your strength?
I mean, I have been lucky enough to have been told by, plenty of people throughout my career, whether they are writers or producers or, superiors, you have a great reputation, you work really well with talent, you're really smart, you're this, you're that. So I know that there is a recognition of my work for my work's sake, and I'm really appreciative of that. But I think it's hard because how many of us have been raised by parents who have told us, it's not enough to be good. You have to be the best. You have to work twice as hard, just to get half as much. And I think when that is just sort of intrinsically ingrained in you, it's really hard to shake. So yeah, there are days when I can just sort of pat myself on the back and say, you did a great job. But I don't think that I necessarily would have had the same, I shouldn't say that. I feel like the drive that I have, unfortunately, comes from a place of feeling like I need to overcome perceptions. You know, I grew up, you and I both grew up in Nebraska. I grew up, I have a lot of mixed feelings about the way that I grew up. I think when I initially sort of went to college and people would ask me about growing up in Nebraska, I would say it was a really idyllic childhood. And it wasn't until I got older and really began to reflect on my background that I was like, oh, there are some things that were kind of messed up about it. Like I would have teachers say to me, oh, I didn't expect you to do so well, or you should not hang out with the other Black kids because people will think that you're like them. Being singled out at a really young age as a person who is an exception to a rule. And I know that those teachers at the time, in their minds, thought that they were complimenting me or helping me, but that is racism, and that is a seed to plant in a young person's head to say you must always distinguish yourself and separate yourself because the automatic perception of you when you walk into a room is that you are less than.
Yeah, and you answered well into my next question about both of us being Nigerians born in Nebraska, and it's just unfortunate that those things were said to you. And I do get what you mean, how in a way those comments were, they in a way drove you to how hard working you are today. It's just unfortunate that sometimes that has to play a factor, or we have to feel that it plays a factor. What advice would you give for a young Nigerian woman or a Black woman in America to, if they want to be where you are at today? What advice would you give them?
First and foremost, I would just say, I'll go back to the Nebraska thing. For me, at the time that I grew up in Nebraska, we were the first, like we were one of a grand total of 2 Black families in our entire neighborhood. And you never saw one of the other families. So like, because their kids were much older. So like we were sort of the presence, the Black face of the community. I was almost always the only Black kid in my classes. And I was already sort of a shy kid to begin with. But I do believe that that experience, taught me the value of individuality. Because, on top of being a Black kid, I was also an immigrant kid. I had a weird name. There was just a lot going on. So there was never the real opportunity for me to sort of blend in and assimilate as much as I necessarily would have wanted to. But that serves me so well in Hollywood, like even down to my name, which I hated so much growing up, like that, in this business is sort of like the best thing. If people know who you are, you're not going to be mixed up with anyone else. But I also think that it taught me to, that background taught me the thing that I do pass on to people, which is there is nobody else like you. You are a unique point of view. You are a unique personality. You are a unique contributor. And you need to celebrate that as opposed to looking for ways to make yourself homogenous and the same as everyone else. Because the differences for me have been the things that have helped me perform the way that I have, that have the very fact that I stood out has been kind of the biggest boon for me in my career. So I would say, don't be afraid to stand out. Have faith in the fact that you are a unique individual and that has value. So don't worry about comparing yourself to other people. And yeah, just work your ass off. If it's something that you really want and that you really deserve, unfortunately, the world is not a merit-based system the way school is, but I do believe that there are people, the right people, who take notice of somebody who really shines, who really is a superstar. So I think showing up, having that energy, having that enthusiasm, and just showing like what you have to offer, it's eventually going to get noticed by somebody.
You are a perfect example of everything that you just shared too. And one thing I wanted to touch on is what you said about oftentimes being the only, not just Black female, but Black person in the classroom, and how it wasn't until this year that I realized that that in many ways was from an advantage standpoint, because places I go now, I have that experience now to learn how to deal with it. What do you think it would have been like, Nne, if you had been in your field now, you heard what some of those executives said, you got those calls about shows such as Blackish. How do you think things would be different had you not experienced it then as a younger individual? In terms of your
I
reaction to it and everything.
Yeah, I think I mean, I can actually point to a really good example because I have a friend who also works in this industry who she had a different experience from me. She went to an all Black college. She grew up in a Black community. She's super smart, really, really great at her job. We sort of have similar backgrounds, with the exception being she had much more sort of connection to Black culture growing up to sort of be this, great support system and warm blanket to wrap yourself in. And I think for her, some of these things that happen are far more outrageous and intolerable just because she's known something different. And sadly, I haven't known any different. So sometimes I will admit some of that stuff just sort of rolls off me where I'm just like, yeah, that's just who people are. And I feel like I can navigate it more smoothly because it is so familiar. It's not great, but it doesn't throw me for a loop. On the flip side, the bad part of it is I am not necessarily, I think, as sensitive to it, as attuned to it in the moment. Like it'll take me until I get home that evening where I'm like, wait a minute. Sometimes with some of those things that are less overt, and so the response time or the follow-up time can be delayed as a result.
Nate, before wrap up, I'm curious to learn, besides the show you mentioned earlier, the White House Plumbers, are there any projects you have in the works that when this is all over, that some stream addicts, show addicts can look forward to, say in a year or two from now? Any that you can spill the
Uh,
beans on?
Let me think what I can talk about. I mean, everything, as you can imagine, is a giant question mark because I think Corona has changed everything. So things, like I said, that were hot at one place might suddenly go cold in an instant. But, if all goes well and the plans prior to Corona don't change things, I have a series at Amazon with Jenny Han, who was the author of To All the Boys I've Loved Before, the big, Netflix movie franchise that has done so well. And we're doing an adaptation of her original book series, The Samurai Turned Pretty, about a young woman coming of age, and really just kind of trying to figure out who she is, even as she, harbors a crush for these two boys who are very, very different. And what's significant about that show for me, and definitely for Jenny, is she grew up, loving all of those teen movies, but never saw anything that had at the center of it a young Asian girl, just something that felt like, why don't we get those stories as well? So it's exciting to be able to, be collaborating with her on creating, something that we hope will be seminal TV for teenagers, but also for adults, about that, nostalgic coming of age time in your life, and just matter of factly having, an Asian teenage girl at the center of that show.
Yeah, I look forward to that. And before we wrap up, Nne, do you have, in terms of the content you shared with me today, and just overall, is there anything that you would like our white friends, counterparts, colleagues to take from our time today in terms of awareness or just knowledge?
I think we're at such a pivotal point in history as a society. What has happened in the wake of the murder of George Floyd was a huge wake-up call, not just to Americans, but around the world. And I've been speaking to a lot of my white friends and colleagues who want to help but are afraid to say or do the wrong thing, afraid to sort of walk into a buzzsaw, despite their good intentions. And the one thing that I just have to offer is, I think the most important thing we can all be doing, Black or white, right now, is just listening. Really, really not rushing to solutions so much as just hearing what it is that other people are experiencing, trying to, put yourself in the shoes of other people. I think that's the first step toward real change, is truly connecting and understanding. And then together we figure out, like, how do we make it better?
Great. And listening is just, it's just amazing how much that scale plays a role in anything in life. And I appreciate you, Nne, for taking the time to be, on this podcast and just share a lot of that behind the scenes stuff that many of us are always interested in learning but don't really know too much of, as well as the insight you gave us being in the field for yourself, your experiences, what you've learned, what's driven you, and the advice you've given um, to people that look like you, but also everybody. So again, and I appreciate your time. Thank you so much, and I look
Thank
forward
you.
to
Thanks for having me.
talking to you soon, and hopefully these shows will absolutely come to light. I'm marking today's date as a time I heard it here first.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Nne.